Okay, so I had Thursday the 21st of March's episode of The Drum. The host was Craig Rucastle. I think that's how you say it. He's a speaker, writer, comedian. He was on War and Waste and The Chaser. On the panel, we had Deborah Snow, who is a senior writer at the Sydney Morning Herald, Jason Yatsen, who is the managing director of Yatsen Associates, a Labor Party member and a former candidate for Bennelong. Bridget Meany is the Vice President for the New South Wales Young Liberals, and Shen Narayanasamy, she's the Human Rights Campaign Director for Get Up. So they discussed the Closing the Gap report, which was released that day, or the day beforehand, I think. One Nation preferences, the New South Wales state election, and the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft review. So to start off with, Craig talked about changes brought in by Jacinda Ardern to New Zealand's gun laws in the aftermath of the Christchurch terror attacks. So he spoke about how quickly she brought the changes in and was saying that was, it sort of showcased like real leadership. I found that really interesting because I once watched a documentary on Australian versus American politicians, and it was about following the Port Arthur massacre. It was speaking about John Howard and how quickly he brought in the reforms, and in an interview he said he didn't care if he was voted out because of the changes he brought in, just because he knew that what he had done was the right thing to do. Whereas the American politicians were afraid to lose their position in office, and so they didn't push it, they just left it and were like, well, I just want to be in politics, so I won't lead. Bridget made the point, actually, that while Australia's gun laws were tightened in 12 days, Australia doesn't have the same emotional connection to guns as Americans do, in that we've never had a civil war or a war of independence. So Craig then went on to question whether Australians are becoming complacent with our gun laws. So the shooter fishers and farmers, which do hold the balance of power now in New South Wales, are calling for changes surrounding the laws. And I think that's quite thought-provoking, especially in light of the revelations that came out today actually about Al Jazeera, which is an undercover investigation into One Nation. And so last year Pauline Hanson was working to obtain funding, I think about $10 million from the NRA in America, and she wanted to use that money to weaken Australia's gun laws. I agree with Deborah Snow when she said that our laws need to be kept under review to make sure that they're the world's best practice. So One Nation is such a massive topic on this episode, and they're really just a hub of ethical discussion. Like, Pauline Hanson uses the party to spread hate speech and racist propaganda, and the intentions of the party are just damaging to everyone that has a progressive thought train, really. So the panel discussed the speculation that Scott Morrison would cave to pressure and create a preference vote with One Nation in a bid to secure marginal seats. And it was actually confirmed that the Liberals would preference One Nation over the Nationals in Western Australia, so long as One Nation then preferenced the Liberals over Labor in the lower house. So that deal was secured to keep Labor out of power, but I think they revoked that following the Al Jazeera revelations. So that was really interesting because I got to watch an episode from last week before the state election, but now it's following the state election and I actually know the results and stuff like that, which is really awesome. Bridget made the point during the discussion that she didn't like that One Nation are considered extremists, and the Greens are not considered extremist. So I kind of agree with her in that they are respectively right and left wing extremists, although I wouldn't have said that the Greens were as extremists. They are extremists, but they're not as extremist. She said the Greens are not subjected to as much scrutiny as One Nation, which to a lot of people, especially like progressive farmers, which is my background, where am I? It just feels dangerous to have the Greens hold so much power. Shen Narayanasamy, I feel like I'm saying her name wrong, but there we are. She's so passionate. It was such a beautiful speech, detailing just how extreme and dangerous Pauline Hanson's party is. So she calls Scott Morrison and subsequently Bridget Heaney, who is the Young Liberals member, to attention for hiding behind the small parties, which is a legitimate point because One Nation and the Greens will never be in power on the same level as Liberals and the Labour will. And yet they expect to be able to like shield themselves behind that just to get seat numbers and stuff like that, just to hold themselves in power. So Deborah Snow says that in the current environment, any party that harbours racist rhetoric, racist sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment should be given pariah status, and their voices in Parliament should not be heard as legitimate. Which begs the question, like, why are they in Parliament? Like, why are we allowing this to happen? Jason uses the term populism, which is actually a form of authoritarian politics attributed by popular elections, but actually holds no respect for minor parties or minority groups. So a liberal democracy is what populism is a rising cause for concern in Australian politics, just given the risk of liberalism at the expense of democracy. The representation of these voices through Parliament, when so many others don't have a voice, is disgusting. It's not ethical. It's dangerous. We've seen it. It's been proved as dangerous. And it just really leads back to the same question, like, why is this being allowed? Which brings you back to the same answer, as being allowed because the big parties want seats, they want numbers, they want to hold power. They don't really care about actually leading. Like, it's so unethical, but really, like, they hold the power, so what do you do in that case? Anyway, that was my episode, and I found it super interesting, and I love the politics.